hope to have a good amount of time for questions and discussions. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar so that a number of folks that were not available today can access this, and will retain it. And I'll let participants know if we can contact you about the way to link into the recording if you want to share that with others. So thank you all. Thanks for joining today. Really enthused about being able to share the findings of the vessel drift and response analysis, which covers a large study area from the Strait of Fuca to the southern Strait of Georgia. My name is Marta Green, and I am the Puget Sound Recovery Coordinator for San Juan County. And I've also been managing some of these related oil spill prevention projects. So I would ask everyone to stay on mute. We're going to pause about halfway through the presentation and take some questions on the drift analysis. And then we'll have time for Q&A also, and discussion at the end of the presentation. So the objectives of this work was really to answer this longstanding question about whether or not an emergency response towing vessel, henceforth referred to as ERTV, so whether an ERTV positioned near the San Juan Islands could be effective in responding to a disabled and distressed vessel, and responding in a way that would prevent it from grounding. So two aspects of that work, the drift analysis and then the response analysis and time for that. So we really want to answer this question, which has been posed a number of times, despite a long-standing conversation about the interest and potential benefit of having an ERTV in these waters. This is a image that represents one of our most constricted shipping lanes at Turn Point, with a Turn Point lighthouse and a vehicle carrier passing by. And I actually took this photo a few years ago, and was a bit startled when the vessel came out from behind the island, Stewart Island there. But it represents some of our challenges. Next slide. Okay, so this is the project team. And I reached out right away when this project seemed to be feasible. I reached out right away to Tim Robertson at NUCA, based on their experience in doing these types of analyses, both for Canada and the Aleutian Islands and other locations in Alaska. He's supported by Brentwood Higman, and Sierra Fletcher really drove the project and was the lead author on the report. We're also very pleased to have partnered with Terang and Sukyong from the Salish Sea Modeling Center, which is part of the Puget Sound Institute within the University of Washington, as our provider of much of the data and the computational capability required for this very large data modeling effort. Next. Really important to this project was reaching out and getting some subject matter expert input as we went along. This is kind of a first of a kind effort, a little different to some of the work that NUCA has done on the coast. And so you can see we had non-governmental organizations involved, governmental with Department of Ecology and the San Juan County Council member, Councilmember Stevens, tribal participation and perspective from Paul McCallan, and also the Canadian perspective from Clear Seas with Jennifer participating, and two other really key subject matter experts in Kim Sundberg and John Venture from the Marine Exchange. So they guided the work, they provided input, but we're not suggesting that they necessarily concurred or approved of all of the parameters or results of the study. And certainly we all recognized and dealt with and will address some of the limitations of this modeling effort. Next. So the agenda for today, I'm just going to give a little bit of background. I think most of you are familiar with the fact we've been talking about an ERTV in these waters for quite a long time. And then I'll turn it over. We'll really speak to the drift modeling and the time to grounding. The data sources, again, key with Sail Sea Modeling Center, recognize the limitations of the work and present the results of that drift study. And then we'll pause and take some questions before we launch into the focus area response time analysis and the ultimate findings of this study, and hopefully have a good amount of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. Okay. So investment in an emergency response towing vessel to reduce the risk of an oil spill has received an oil spill specifically in the waters of Harrow Strait, Boundary Pass, as well as Rosario, but Rosario was a bit beyond our scope of this work. But it has received transboundary support. And the discussions certainly go back more than 5 years, but just since September 2016, there was kind of a key workshop that the Department of Ecology sponsored. And they, in this workshop, positioning an ERTV in these waters was identified as the third highest priority of all spill prevention mitigation measures. And the recommendation out of that workshop was that we needed a cost benefit business model. So the county, San Juan County, took that challenge on and conducted an economic analysis, which we completed more than 2 years ago now. And basically, I think we demonstrated the cost benefit business model. We were very conservative in just looking at the costs to San Juan County of an oil spill, not including the cost of response or natural resource damage assessment, restoration, but just looking at the ultimate cost to our county, which conservatively showed over $500 million in direct costs, even though the spill would extend well beyond our county. And relative to the cost of positioning a tug here, which was on the high end about $6 million that we estimated at the time. In May of 2018, Islands Trust and San Juan County jointly requested to Transport Canada to position an ERTV in Sydney, which they and the Canadian Coast Guard acknowledged, but there was no further discussion following that request. Next. Importantly, there's been legislation here in Washington around this issue. The Senate Bill 6267 here 3 years ago now recommended or would have required an ERTV to be positioned here, to be funded by vessels calling on Washington ports and traveling through Harrow Strait, Boundary Pass, or Rosario Strait. And that bill did not pass. It came back, sponsored by Representative Lukanov the following year, and the bill was changed a bit, both in its initial form, where it said Department of Ecology may invoke rulemaking for that purpose. Ultimately, House Bill 1578 was changed substantially and had the Department of Ecology required to do a risk analysis modeling, to develop a model for spill risk analysis, and to include analysis of whether an ERTV could be effective in these waters. So just want to acknowledge the work that Representative Lukanov continues to do in support and being a very strong voice on this matter. The work that Ecology is doing to develop the model is ongoing, it's underway. It's quite a broad scope and will be a tremendous asset and capability as they move through a broader analysis of vessel movement, vessel encounters, whereas we felt, though, that that requirement to be completed by September 2023 was too far off. We really wanted to alert our efforts here to answering the specific question of whether or not an ERTV could be effective in these waters, and just really address that specific question. During the Orca Task Force work, the recommendation came up again, and also the question of whether the ERTV could be effective in these narrow waterways, whether it could respond soon enough. So what we wanted to do is take the methods and the model developed by Nuka Research and Planning Group that they applied for Canada's West Coast and extend that modeling to the inland waters. So that work by Nuka was completed, I think 2018, and it justified for Canada investment of actually $67 million for both the Atlantic Eagle that you see in this slide, and the Atlantic Raven, a similarly very large ERTV to be positioned off the west coast of Canada. If you would go back a slide, please, just to show, this is the tug that's in Nia Bay right now, and what the legislation and the work that we've done has been based on the success of this type of tug that's been stationed in Nia Bay. Okay. So two different types of vessels, but both providing protection, particularly along the coast right now. And so the question is, would something like this permanently positioned in the inland waters, could it be effective? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Robertson. Tim is the technical lead on this project, and he will lead you through the next set of slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. I just want to make sure that you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Tim Robertson. I'm a principal consultant with Nuka Research and Planning Group. And as Marta said, we worked this project based on the scope of work that was to essentially use the same model that we had developed and used in Alaska and on the outside waters of Western Canada, and apply that to these inland waters. We always like to start our work with a research question or two, and let those guide our analysis, so that we know when we have answered the question, we've done the analysis. So The first question we had is, for any given location, how much time would be available for an ERTV to arrive at a disabled vessel before it may drift aground when considering winds and currents? And for any location, that basically means in any point in space within the study area. We have a second question, which I'll address about halfway through the presentation, which has to do with how long will it take a tug or an ERTV to get to a disabled vessel in a focus area that we looked at. This is the scope of our project. The model that we developed covered all of the waters in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and up through Boundary Pass and Harrow Straits, Rosario Straits, extending down into Puget Sound and up into the Strait of Georgia. And then when we get to the second question, you'll see that we chose 4 focus areas for additional analysis in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass. So every model starts with something that drives it, and in our model is based on winds and currents from the Sailor Sea Modeling Center at the University of Washington. They had a data set from 2014 through 2017, so 4 years of data that we could use to draw on for winds and currents to look at our ship drift. And then we had a algorithm to predict the trajectory of a ship once it was adrift and is subject to the forces of the winds and currents. The model, the space that I showed you was divided into 100 by 100 meter grid cells. And so the area, the water area within that space was about 3.7 million grid cells. And then we ran our model randomly drawing 15-hour periods from the data set of winds and currents. So they were sequential times. And then we would run the model again with another random draw of 15 hours. And the resulting of that was in 6,500 model runs, we created 15.6 billion estimates of how long it would take a ship to drift to grounding from a given cell within the space. And once we had this large data set of ship drift to grounding times, that was the data that we drew from for the subsequent analysis that we did and the visualizations that you'll see today. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tarang with the Sailor Sea Modeling Center and let him explain that model and the work that's gone in to develop a very detailed estimation of currents in the Sailor Sea area and the winds that are associated with it, with that model. Tarang, can you hear me?
Yes, very good. Thank you, Tim. To follow what Tim said, the currents and winds data that went into NUCA research analysis came from the Sailor Sea model. And I have a few slides here which explains the background about the Sailor Sea model and how currents data is computed. The Sailor Sea model itself is not a new model. We have been developing it since 2009, more than 10 years ago. The model development was started to address a different question. It was funded by US EPA and Washington State Department of Ecology to solve the problem of hypoxia. So we have this Sailor Sea, it's a complex fjord, and we have hypoxia occurs in certain subbasins within Sailor Sea, but not others. And so for several years, we worked at it, developing the model. And it wasn't until 2018 that everything came together. In order to get the interbasin exchange right and get dissolved oxygen right, we had to get the circulation just right. And so we developed a model for dissolved oxygen, but in the process of doing so, we have the model itself produce very good ability to reproduce exchange flows, currents, tides, and that performance caught the eye of folks at NOAA. Next slide, please. So NOAA folks who run operational models around the country are focused on accurate predictions of currents and tides for the purpose of navigational support. And based on the performance of the SAIL-EC model, they adopted SAIL-EC model to be pulled into their network of operational forecast system models. And in doing so, they requested us to refine the model to a factor 10 times larger than our regular SAIL-EC model. And so that project happened over the last 3 years. And when Nuka Research called us to inquire about the availability of currents, and it was the right timing. So we had just completed this high resolution model, and we told Nuka that you could have our results from 2014, 15, and years 16 and 17 for their work. Next slide, please. So this model, high resolution model, is being developed for NOAA folks to use, and NOAA folks have very strict requirements on the model skill. And we have just completed that skill assessment, first round of it. To do the skill assessment, NOAA folks went ahead and collected currents data from 130 stations around Puget Sound, Strait of Fuca, and San Juan Islands area. And we have spent quite a bit of effort trying to match a model to data, and we find the performance is satisfactory. But calibration is a process that never finishes. So we have finished one suite, and we have the model working at the required skill level. And we are going to continue this effort going forward. And next slide, please. And just to give a sense of how the model works and how it produces currents, we have just an animation just to give a feel for the complexity of currents in the region of interest. So you see currents going back and forth over a one-day period through Haro Strait and through Boundary Pass. And you can see the model has good shoreline resolution to reproduce all the complex eddies and circulation patterns. And this is just for us to get a sense for what would happen if there were a spill and how it would spread around. And that's it. These currents were provided to Nuka.
Thank you, Tarang. So then we had our currents, and Tarang didn't mention it, but they had an analogous set of winds that were used to drive the model from, and so we acquired those as well. And so then we used our drift trajectory. The animation that Tarang showed was a drift trajectory for an oil spill. And this trajectory model is similar in that, but it considers ships instead of oil. And we calculated a trajectory for a loaded mid-sized container ship of 7,500 TEU or 83,000 deadweight ton container ship. And this is the same ship model that we used in the Aleutians and on the outer coast of Western Canada and also in Cook Inlet. So it's analogous between all of our studies, and it's representative of a typical vessel that would be passing through these areas. There would be differences if you used another vessel, but we'll talk about that when we get to the limitations. So our model uses 100% of the current speed and direction as a vector for that ship drift. And we use a proportion of the wind speed calculated from a ship drift analysis that I'll show you an example of. Because ships don't drift downwind, directly downwind, necessarily. They'll typically veer from a straight downwind drift. We varied our calculations by a random function around a normal distribution of drift angles from straight downwind. So we went 45 degrees left and 45 degrees right. We put a normal distribution on that and then selected from that. And so for each trajectory, we would use 100% of the current and direction, and we would use the speed from the as a proportion of the wind speed, and then the direction for the drift from the wind speed would be varied. And once we set that direction, we would continue it through the rest of that trajectory run. So this is you know, what I just explained in terms of a vector diagram. So if a ship was starting at this location, we would assume that it would move with the current in the same direction and at the same speed as the current. And we would assume that it would move with the wind at a proportion of the total wind speed. And then we would vary that direction from directly downwind, 45 degrees left or right. And you would end up with the ship being at the end of one of these arrows. And this is a technique that has been used in other ship trajectory models. This diagram was taken from Galt and Hansen for a study that they did in the Bering Sea. I said that we used a proportion of the wind speed. This is a graph showing that proportion. So each of the dotted lines is like 10% of the wind speed, 8% of the wind speed, 6%, 4%, 2%. So if you're on the dotted line for a given wind speed, that you would achieve the analogous drift speed. And the function that we used is just a little greater than 10% at low wind speeds, and then degrades down to 10% at the higher wind speeds. And when that is fit to data, you can see it's fairly conservative. So these data are ships that were drifting from data that was provided to us from the Alaska Marine Exchange. And we then looked at each case and looked at the speed that the ship was drifting relative to the wind speed. These were all in open ocean, so there were negligible currents for them. And you can see that most of them were lower than the function that we used, but there were a couple that were a little bit higher at the low end. You also notice that most of the vessels were bulk carriers. So these are deep draft ships that don't have very much windage. And so they tend to be less affected by wind than something like a container ship. So you would expect them to not drift as fast relative to the wind as a high windage vessel like a container ship. And a cruise ship or a vehicle carrier are also high windage vessels, and so you would expect them to be more analogous to the container ship that we modeled. The function that we used was provided by the Glosson Associates, and it was part of the study that we did for the Aleutian Islands risk assessment. So given that and the data set that we had from running the model, we wanted to be able to visualize that, to present it as a result that would answer the research question. And so we had used one type of presentation for other studies that we had done, but we thought for this study that time of drift was more important than probability of grounding. So the metric that we chose to show in previous studies was probability of a ship grounding when it started drifting from a certain spot before a tug or an ETV could get to it. But for the first question here, we focused in on time. So you're really pulling from the same data, but you're just essentially visualizing or showing a different metric. So just to kind of, think about this a little bit, if you have your grid cells, and for each grid cell in the space that you're working in, you have 6,500 estimates of how long it would take a ship to ground from that location based on a randomly drawn set of winds and currents from 4 years. You could display those times to grounding and as a distribution, and you would get a curve. I've shown a bell-shaped curve here. The time distribution for the data that we actually have is a little bit more skewed. It tends to be skewed to the left. But in any distribution, if you remember your statistics, there's the high point or median, which it's 50% of the times would be greater than that time, 50% of the times would be less than that time. There's a little difference between median and average. They're the same for a normal distribution, but for a non-normal distribution, they are different things. So we chose to use median as our case, the case that's most likely based on the data that we have. But you don't want to do emergency response planning on a 50-50 basis. So we also looked at what we would consider to be a bad case. A worst case is, when you talk about statistics, it is not representative of an event that's very likely to happen at all. But you can take a percentile, a 95th percentile, and we'll call that a bad case. So 95% of the times to grounding would have been slower at this bad case, and 5% would have been faster. So the intent is to be able to show you the median case and a bad case in order to draw conclusions about how long would it take a vessel to drift aground from any given area. Before I actually show the maps, I wanted to talk a little bit about the model limitations. All models are approximations of real world systems, and many are useful, but no model is an exact representation of actual events. The weather forecast is a good example of that, and our model is the same as any other model. We had a lot of comments about the fact that our model starts at the time that the vessel is truly drifting. So it starts when the vessel is subject to the forces of winds and currents, and it does not consider the momentum of the vessel as it slows. And we recognize that that is a limitation of this model, but if you think about it, it's a very difficult thing to model. So for any given incident, the ship is traveling along under its own power, and it has a rudder, and the master is in control of the vessel and where the vessel's going and what it's doing. And then it becomes disabled, and it loses its power, and it may or may not lose its rudder as well. And then it starts to slow. And the inertia, the momentum of that vessel will take it for quite some time for these larger vessels. But it's not completely at the mercy of the winds and currents. And the master, if he has a rudder, can direct the direction of the vessel. There may be other things that can be done on board the vessel to control that the vessel while it coasts to a stop when it is truly drifting. So the kind of model that we run is not appropriate to model that phase of an incident. It can be modeled. It could be looked at with a ship simulator or something like that, but it doesn't fit well within our model. And we are also tasked with doing something that was analogous to the work that we had done elsewhere. And in all cases, the other work that we've done started at the time that the ship began to drift based on the forces of the winds and the current. And as I've said, the model does not account for the actions of the master, pilot, or crew to self-arrest or maneuver or any other interventions that might come along. And it's important for everybody to realize that the folks that are out there that are responsible for maneuvering these vessels are very resourceful people, and they do have great skills and training and experience in dealing with a vessel that loses power and becomes disabled. And so we really can't incorporate that into our model. As I said, the study models a mid-sized container ship. There is some uncertainty about what the drift characteristics would be for other vessel types. We feel that we initially looked at a tanker and a container ship. We found that from the study, and this was in the studies that we did in the Aleutians, we found that the container ship was a worse case than the tanker in terms of speed of drift. And so we focused on the higher windage vessel. So our expectation would be that low windage vessels such as bulk carriers or tankers would not ground as quickly as the model would suggest, and that vessels that have higher windage than a mid-sized container ship may in fact ground quicker than the model would suggest. I'm going to move now to the results, and the results for this question about how long would it take the ship to drift to ground are presented in a map, and the contours on the map are not depths, they're times. So you can see, and we ran our model for 15 hours, so any time greater than 15 hours, we don't know. So in this case, a ship that went adrift at the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, based on our model runs, would have longer than 15 hours before it might ground. And then there's a 15-hour dark line, and then you go 14 down to another dark line at 10 hours and another dark line at 5 hours, and then actually to the grounding point. So that's how you read the map. So you can look at any point in space and determine how long, in the median case, it would take a ship that started drifting from whatever location you chose until it ground. And again, this is based on 6,500 model runs. I'm going to stop just a second, take a drink, see if I can clear my throat. So this is the median case, and this is the bad case. So this is 95 percentile. So 5% of the drift cases would be quicker than this, and 95% would take longer than this. And so in the bad case, out in the middle of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, we're looking at greater than 4 hours. And then we have a 4-hour contour, 3-hour contour, 2, and then 1. And that gives you a sense for on a bad day how long you would have before a vessel grounded. Bad meaning bad in terms of it not taking very long. So I guess I will stop there and see if there are any questions on what I've presented so far, and then we'll go into the second part of our analysis, which focused in on the 4 focus areas and actually looked at ERTV speeds. And I can't see hands, or so I'll let Sierra call on folks that raise their hands if that's how we want to do it.
Yeah, I would say I don't see any questions in the chat right now, and I don't see any hands up. So if anybody would like to unmute and go ahead and ask your question, that would be great. Or type it in the chat if you prefer. I don't see anything, Tim.
I could
Oh, yeah.
not miss the opportunity to chat. The one feedback I got was because you start with the vessel dead in the water, that you lose that that inertia associated with however fast it was going when it was underway, so that the time to grounding could be seen as a minimum estimate. How would you respond to that?
A minimum estimate in terms of it has already traveled some distance before the model takes effect. Is that what you mean, Fred?
Yeah, that it's underway. I mean, it's counteracting, of course, is that whether the captain can rudder itself to keep from grounding. But the fact is that you have, in addition to this phenomenal current analysis, you don't have the incorporation of the speed of the vessel before it comes to a rest.
Yeah, well, it actually would, there would be a time from the time that it became disabled to that it went to become totally drifting, and that time could be substantial. I mean, my understanding from talking to pilots and masters is 20 to 45 minutes, and that time would be added to the time that the model would show. So it actually would be longer total time from the time the vessel became disabled until it went aground, and then the model indicates by that that time to coast to a stop.
Okay, maybe go back to the contour map, because I think part of it too is that the contour map results for this piece shows all the different locations. So it's not envisioning a scenario where it's the time from the point at which something goes wrong. It's the time from any of those locations in this piece of the analysis. And then the next part required some assumptions about where vessels might be in order to line up with response times.
Yeah, so if a vessel, if a vessel was here at the tip of my cursor and became disabled and the master still had rudder, he might point it away from land, and it might end up, here before it actually went adrift. But once it went adrift, our estimate, our 95 percentile estimate of the time that it would have is more than 4 hours, less than 5.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Sure.
Tim, there's also a question in the chat about the vessel size that was modeled relative to potential much larger container ships that could come to the area.
Yeah, so a 7,500 TEU container ship is not the largest that comes into the area. I'm sure there's somebody online that could answer this question better than I, but my recollection is it's about 12,500 is the largest ships that are coming into the Strait of Juan to Fuca now. They go up to 20,000, which we saw one of those in the Suez Canal recently, but the facilities in this area can't handle the mega size. I don't know, anybody else want to comment on how large a container ship does come into the area?
I think the question might be more about why we didn't use larger ships in the model based on what we had available for ship drift and what would need to be done in order to be able to apply this model to larger ships. Or maybe Brent, please jump in if I'm not understanding the question right.
We used the model.
Yeah.
Oh, here you go.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. That was it. It was just, recognizing that we do have proposals to bring those much larger container ships into this area. What would that look like? And did the researchers consider doing that modeling? And if not, I guess the follow-up question is, what would it take to do that modeling? Thank you.
The art of coming up with that function of ship drift speed versus wind speed is a separate skill set than what we have and what we have applied to here. It's more appropriately done by a naval architect, and they have different ways of coming up with those drift functions. We have looked far and wide for other drift functions, and it wasn't within the scope of or the budget of this project to go out and commission another analysis of drift speed. This seemed to be the most appropriate one. It's one that we had used in other locations, so you can compare the results from one study to the next for us. It certainly is something that could be done and easily applied, within this domain, but we did not do it.
And then a question about whether the different depths of the surface currents were used depending on the draft of the vessel.
Yes. So we, as I recall, we did not use the surface. That I think we used the 3 meter depth. We used a 10-meter grounding line. We recognize that deep draft ships are affected by the currents, not deeper than just the surface current. And so we did not use just the surface current. And I would have to go back to our analyst to verify, but I think 3 meters is the current depth that we used. We did not vary the depth of the current, based on different vessels, because we only modeled one vessel.
And Fred, did you have another comment?
Yeah, the estuarine shear is really down about 100 feet. So the idea that you would have a countervailing current, it will be going the opposite direction at about 100 feet because of the surface freshwater flow coming out of the Fraser primarily. But in terms of its major impact on the drift, I think if you're just dealing with 3 meters or so, that shouldn't be a significant impact. But as far as the size of the ships that are calling, certainly 7,500, I don't know what the average is right now, but it's getting bigger, but they're not gonna likely be, Suez Canal size. The Ever Given those ships are in the European trade. So for the Trans-Pacific trade for the not too distant future, we'll still be maybe maxing out at 12. And I'm just wondering, is there some rule of thumb you could maybe apply the same, given the additional windage from 7,500 to 12.5? Is there some rough estimate about how much more windage that might afford its effect? I guess its primary, it will sit deeper in the water as well as higher above the water. So can you make a guesstimate whether those things are going?
How much faster?
Yeah.
Well, if you go back to this graph, you can see that the bulk carriers, the low windage vessels, are a couple of percent less than or maybe as much as 3% less than the container ship that we did model. You can see that this Lower Marsk, which I think is about the same size as the one that we modeled, actually performed drifted a little faster than the model would characterize. My opinion is that a vessel like a vehicle carrier would be even worse, and so you might see a vehicle carrier, in this range up here at 12 or 14%. So I think that's kind of the variability that you're going to see around this function based on ship type. So that'd be my best guess, Fred.
So you could present this stuff as a range, right? I mean, in terms of, certainly you don't have to go from a deep draft like a bulker, but like within the, like a car carrier being the worst. I guess I should know this, but so as a percentage of wind versus current, which is worse?
Well, the current is, we're using 100% of the current. And in the case of, our function here, it's about 10% of the wind. So the current is really the biggest driver.
So in that sense, though, again, while the bigger container ships will sit deeper, I think proportionally they'll sit higher. So if the current is the more driving factor, the container ships barely sit, I mean, the ro-ros are, mostly above water. So I mean, I'm just trying to get to Brent's question about if you increase the size of the container ship, it's more of a function of depth than it is of height, is what I think you're saying.
No, I think the height goes up. I think it would drift faster relative to the wind speed than the ship that was modeled. I don't think it would be significantly faster. And so, if we're changing the estimate of wind speed in every vessel in the whole study uses the same current model. So the current as a driver doesn't change at all. Okay. But the drift relative to the wind would, and it potentially could be for a very light ship, 2 or 3% faster, in my opinion, without having put pen to paper on. So.
I'm going to jump in, and probably not the first time I've jumped in on the two of you talking about ships. I just want to take a question from Werner and then move on, because the presentation is not over and we do have more time for questions at the end to come back to some of this. But there's a question in the chat here. Is hydrography taken into account? And recalling that NOAA was doing some studies about that.
I don't, can you give a
Werner, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I guess it has a little bit to do with, the depths of the different, currents at different tables of the water. But I was just wondering if that was taken into account. I'm not sure how much hydrographic mapping has been accomplished in Sailor Sea, but that could affect, current speed and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so we took the currents that the Sailor Sea model gave us, and I would leave it to Terang to make any comments that he might on hydrography and that.
Yeah, certainly. The Sailor Sea model itself is a fully three-dimensional model, and it includes bathymetry. That's a combination of bathymetry collected by Department of Fish and Oceans, Canada, NOAA folks collected bathymetry, and a detailed combined bathymetric set that was put together by University of Washington. But perhaps you're referring to the survey that NOAA conducted that collected detailed three-dimensional currents using acoustic Doppler profiler over 130 stations. We use those current meter data sets to serve as a validation step. So the three-dimensional effects of complex bathymetry is incorporated into the currents that were provided to NOAA.
Thanks, Terang. And Tim, I think it's probably time to move on, and I don't see other questions right now either. So thank you, everybody, for jumping in.
Okay, yeah, great conversation. So the second research question that we had used the results again of the first part of the study, and when considering 4 focus areas around San Juan County, what is the probability that a ERTV or tug would arrive before a disabled ship on a typical route might drift aground? And so we estimated the time for a ERTV to get to the 4 focus areas from 7 potential starting points. So these are the 4 focus areas, and this is the 50 percentile map for those 4 focus areas. And this is the 95th percentile map for those 4 focus areas. And you can see that in some areas, as you go through Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass and around Turn Point, in a bad case, the times to grounding are less than an hour. And if you were close to shore, it might be less than 30 minutes. And this is when kind of all the stars are aligned against you, and the currents and the winds are all driving you onto a lee shore. So we wanted to study that in more depth. We got input from the contributors that we needed to focus in on this area, and indeed on vessels that start drifting from the typical shipping routes. And we therefore did an analysis of how long it would take to get an ERTV from these 7 locations. Nia Bay, because there is an ERTV station there, Port Angeles, Anacortes, Roche Harbor, Victoria, Sydney, and Deltaport. And with the exception of Roche Harbor, there are tow vessels located in all of those other places, or visit them frequently. So our approach to this was to essentially define a typical route through one of the areas of interest. This is the Boundary Pass area of interest. So we looked at AIS data, and in the end, we basically went right down the middle of the fairway and described that as a typical shipping route. And so we wanted to look at what were the overall times to grounding for vessels that would start to drift from along this red line. So if you go back to the kind of figure that we looked at before, for every 100 meters sail along that red line, there's a set of estimates of how long it would take a ship that started there to ground, and 6,500 estimates for each point along the line. And so what we did is we averaged those. So for within the focus area along that red line, we averaged all of the times to groundings. And we again displayed them as a distribution, but this time instead of a straight distribution, we did a cumulative distribution. And so that's this blue line here. And so as you start at 0 time and you go to up to 15 hours, the percentage of vessels that have grounded are displayed on this line. And this line is not based on actual data, it's just for illustration purposes. So, but in this case, at this time here, 80% of the vessels that began drifting from along that typical route would have grounded. And then we kind of flipped that on its head, because we wanted to look that for any given time, what percentage of the vessels have not yet grounded, so are still available to be rescued, if you will. And so that's the inverse of that line. And that's the red line, and you're going to see that again in a few minutes. So just wanted you to understand where that came from. So the graphs that I'm going to show you show the percentage of the ships that are still drifting versus the time, and compare that to the amount of time it takes an ERTV to arrive on scene for a given start location. So the next thing we needed to do was to estimate that time. How long would it take an ERTV to get to a given location? We could have done that with just one speed, but we decided to try to bound it because we realized that that's not a straightforward thing. When a vessel leaves a place and heads out to do a rescue, it's subject to the conditions at the time. There may be a tidal current that affects it. There may be a sea state that affects it. The master has to choose the route that they would take, and different vessels go at different speeds. So to just pick one speed, we wanted to pick a range of speeds. And so we did a fast estimate, and that essentially, the other thing that varies is where you have to get to in order to do the rescue. We assume that the ship started drifting from the typical route, but it in fact it is not going to ground along that line. It's going to ground somewhere along the grounding line that's parallel to the shoreline. So the rescue vessel is not headed necessarily to the typical route or the center of the area of interest. It's headed to the shoreline that the drifting vessel is drifting towards. It's actually headed to the vessel, but the vessel's headed to the shoreline, so the disabled vessel. So that's another factor that changes the amount of time. So we used times of 7 knots for a slow time, 10 knots for a mid time, and 15 knots for a fast time to represent how fast the ERTV would transit toward the drifting vessel. And then we looked at the distance from the location that the ERTV started to the area of interest. And in the fast time, we took essentially the closest grounding line in the area of interest. And in the slow time, we took the longest. And so by doing this, we took all these different factors and we contributed to them to make a range of times. And so it's maybe not the absolute, but it's a best guess at what's the fastest time you could get to a vessel that started drifting from that typical route, and what's the longest time or the slowest time that it would take. And so, and then you also have the mid time, which is your best guess, I guess. So we did that exercise. We looked at a safe transit route. We used 5 fathoms of water depth, typical routes that vessels travel in these areas, and plotted a route, figured out the distance, and then applied the speed and came up with a time. And so in this case, a vessel that was leaving Sydney Harbor and headed to Turn Point, area of interest, about the fastest that it could get there after it started moving was about 7/10 of an hour. The mid time was about 1.2 hours, and the slowest time to get to the farthest area within Turn Point area of interest was about 1.8 hours. So that's how that works. And then this is how it's displayed. So this is the set of data for Turn Point displayed as a graph. It's these numbers shown as a graph with the fastest time, the slowest time, and the mid time. And then they're in each case for each area of interest, they're sorted by the fastest first. So in this case, you can see that the fastest time was Sydney, which was just about the same as Roche Harbor, with Roche Harbor taking a little longer at the slow end of the bar. And then an ERTV leaving from Victoria would occupy this range of times in our estimate. Delta Port up at Point Roberts, Anacortes, Port Angeles, and Nia Bay. So we're going to combine the 2 figures that I've shown you. And this is the combination. And so for each area, you can see that inverse curve that shows you how many vessels are still available to be rescued for any given time. Time scales down here. So in this case, at 5 hours, I'll follow that up, and there's about 32, 33%, or about 30% of the vessels that started drifting, still drifting in this case. And then down below, we have the graph that I showed you about how long it takes a ERTV to get there from the various locations. And so you can follow those up and see what percentage of the vessels were still available to be rescued at the time that the ERTV got there. So again, we saw that Sydney and Roche Harbor were approximately equal for Turn Point. And if we took the mid-time estimate for them, we would come up to about 85% of the vessels would still be drifting around out there by the time they got to on scene. And you can see the range that's associated with that if they went faster or slower. And then the other thing that's interesting to me about this is that there's the shapes of these curves. You can see if you start on the northern end at Boundary Pass, the curve is not as steep as it is at Turn Point. That totally makes sense. You know, you have more sea room there, probably a little bit less current. And so, the amount of vessels that are still available to be saved for a given period of time is more than it is for Turn Point. And then, if you look as you go to Northern Harrow Strait, it becomes again better scenario than at Turn Point. And then you go into Southern Harrow Strait, which actually is, you know, the eastern end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. There's more sea room, less current, and therefore the curve is flatter. So we hope that this gives the tools that policymakers might need to make, you know, decisions about sighting vessels, and it's not an absolute probability of a rescue, but it is an estimate of the amount of time that you have to make a rescue and the amount of time it would take to get vessels that are starting from these 7 locations to the scene. So we summarized all of this as findings, and so starting out in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the median case of time to grounding is generally greater than 10 hours. And a bad case, it's at least 3 hours if you're in the area of the strait where vessels normally transit. And in the southern Strait of Georgia, the median case is generally greater than 5 hours. And in a bad case, it's at least 2 hours. And then we move into the focus areas. And so for Boundary Pass, the median case is generally greater than 3 hours, and a bad case is less than an hour. And when considering the mid time for an ERTV to arrive from to a vessel that began drifting from the typical route, it would arrive in time to save about 80% of the disabled vessels. And the other rates I won't go into, they're in the report, but you can see the farther away you get, the less percentage of vessels are still available having not grounded. Turn Point, the 50th percentile time was about 3 hours to grounding, and the 95th percentile is less than an hour. And when we considered the time for an ERTV to arrive, again, Roche Harbor and Sydney were essentially equal in terms of arriving in time to rescue 80% of the disabled vessels. And for Northern Harrow Straits, the median time was 3 hours throughout the area. The 95th percentile time was less than an hour. And then when considering arrival times for ERTVs, again, Roche Harbor and Sydney were very, very close to the same. And finally, for the Southern Harrow Strait, the median time was generally at least 5 hours, and the bad case was an hour. And when considering an ERTV, the ERTV stationed at Victoria would be the fastest there, but it's also very much in the same range as Roche Harbor and Sydney, where about 90% of the vessels are still available to be saved. So in summary, the areas around Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass represent, it's a significant challenge to capabilities for a successful emergency tow. I think everyone knew that going into the study. In the worst case, vessels traveling along the typical route would have under an hour before grounding. And when you consider ERTV locations, Roche Harbor and Sydney, of the areas that we studied, would seem to have the best chance of successful rescue, or arriving in time to rescue about 80% of the cases studied. And I'll stop there, and we can discuss that portion of the presentation, or anything really.
I'm just looking for hands or chats, or anybody's welcome to unmute and jump in as well. Oh, I see. Sorry, here's a question. I'm sorry if I missed this, but did you use any actual drifting vessels and their known movements to ground truth the model?
The drift function that I showed for the Gloston model, the dots that were on that were actual drifting vessels, but they weren't in this area, and they weren't subject to currents. They were just subject to winds.
Fred?
Thanks
Hey.
again.
Go ahead.
Did this range of speeds of response time. But did you build in just like a half an hour for mustering to get the ship off the dock?
Yes, I did. And my memory is going to fail me here, but that's a good point. So as you go through the sequence, there has to be recognition that there is a problem. There's got to be notification. Then there is mobilization to get the vessel away from the dock. And then there is the time of transit. And then the time on scene to essentially maneuver past the line and get the vessel under tow. And all of those, so the time of recognition and notification, we considered to have occurred during the period of time from when the vessel became disabled while it was drifting to a stop. So by the time it got to where it was beginning of our model, we would have assumed that the ERTV would have been notified. And we used 18 minutes, which is 3/10 of an hour, for mobilization. The tug at Neo Bay, I believe, is required to mobilize within 20 minutes. So that's where we came up with that. We used the actual calculated transit times based on speed that I did talk about a lot. And then we assumed 2/10 of an hour or 12 minutes for the tug to maneuver and pass the line on scene. And so those times that I just showed in the table not only considered the time of travel, but it considers the time for mobilization and the time for maneuvering on scene.
Thank you. And do you have a model for just a tanker drift? Or is it only this 7,500 container ship?
We do have a model. We have a function for tanker drift relative to wind speed. If you're looking at it, it's more conservative in that it doesn't drift as fast relative to the wind speed. We did not run that function or that model within this analysis.
considering it's the tanker that could really ruin your decade, it's good to know that this estimate then, as it applies to tankers, is then a more of a worst case scenario.
Yes, it is, definitely. Tankers don't drift as fast relative to wind as the vessels that we estimated. You would have longer with a tanker or a bulk carrier for any given case.
There are a couple of questions in the chat now.
Can I just add one thing to Fred's comment is that the county is more concerned about the container ships than the tankers, because the tankers are escorted through these waters. So it's the container ships carrying potentially large amounts of fuel that are perhaps a greater threat. And that's related to a question in the chat about escort.
It's actually the Georgia Bank bulkers that concern me the most. And so they would drift like a tanker. And it's those that are very frequent to Port of Vancouver that would be the most likely a high volume of those, just in terms of just to get a sense of the probabilities.
So Tim, there's a question in the chat about what about tugs of opportunity in the area? Did you consider them?
So not specifically. There have been a number of studies done on tugs of opportunity within in this area. We did one with Clear Seas, and there was one done for another project. But we acknowledge there are tugs of opportunity, and if the tug of opportunity happened to be located where we said an ERTV would start from, the results would be similar. But no, we did not specifically do anything with tugs of opportunity.
So Tim, the study that you did, though, you estimated the amount of time that a tug of opportunity may be in the area. And
yes.
What was that percent of time? And then the second part of that question is, I mean, we're modeling a scenario where we've got a dedicated ERTV that can mobilize in 18 minutes. So that may not be the case for a tug of opportunity, particularly if they're engaged in another duty.
So the question about tugs of opportunity is relative to, what capability does that tug need to have in order to be considered capable of rescuing a disabled vessel? There's a lot of parts and pieces to that question. The tug's capability itself, its size, its bollard pull, its the type of configuration that it has. Is the crew trained to do emergency towing? And then the disabled vessel, in terms of how big is the disabled vessel, and then what is the situation with the disabled vessel? What are the forces against it in terms of currents and winds? So it's a complex question. Some of the work that has been done says, taking just one little part of that, sort of the minimum tug bollard pull that would be required to be utilized to do an emergency tow for these large vessels is about 70 metric tons. And so we estimated for various classes of bollard pull, the percentage that was in, these large grid sails that were 40 kilometers on a side. And so we looked at 70 metric ton bollard pull tugs, and we looked at and greater, and we looked at 90 metric ton bollard pull and greater. And I'm hesitant to say the number without having looked at the report recently, but my recollection is that for 90 metric ton bollard pull, they were generally in this area because of the escort vessels a high percentage of the time, but but I don't, again, I don't want to say what that, that actual number was. I saw Jim had signed on, and I don't know, Jim, if you've got the report handy and you could comment on that, but because in this area, there are the tugs that escort the tankers. There is a very high percentage compared to the rest of the coast of time that there is a large tug in the area.
So what we reported, Tim, was 30% of the time.
Okay. Again, I'm not.
Again, that not necessarily a high percent of the time.
Should probably have reviewed that prior to our presentation today. It's just not on the top of my head.
And I'm just going to ask others to jump in. I'm not sure if we've captured or addressed now the comments regarding the tugs of opportunity, et cetera, or if there are other questions, or if anybody else has a question.
I have another one. This is Fred again. It seems the tug of opportunity availability is really relevant after, several hours, and that the value of a dedicated vessel is really about the emergent response. And so if you get 5 hours, you could probably find a tug that's going to get there. So it seems to me if you constrained the study to the very short time frame, I think tugs of opportunity would be really limited to the escorts provided by the Kinder Morgan tankers. But one of the things that I've always thought that, if this kind of thing was deployed, that because of AIS and VTS, that we know when vessels are coming and going with a lot of lead time, and that the tug could just get off the dock, when a pulse of ships are coming through, reducing its initial mustering time. Whereas, for much of the time, it could be sitting at the dock. So you could reduce your response time based on the predictability of the arrival of those ships.
Yeah, and that would be, in Alaska, they would call that a sentinel escort. You're not actually escorting the vessel, but you're on standby, ready, in the water, ready to go.
And just it strikes me in a narrow waterway, that would be the, preferred way of doing it. And so the near-term response time would be faster, whereas after amount of time goes by, the tug of opportunity becomes, more viable.
I just went back to this figure because to give a sense of the time scale that we're dealing with in these waters. And as Fred says, it is, it is abbreviated compared to other scenarios.
I see Werner has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for doing this and all the work that you put into it. I guess my question or point is that there's I guess people are wondering, which side of the countries are going to be hosting such a vessel, and who's going to be paying for it. I also did see that the Coast Guard is going to be possibly tripling its size of its fleet in the Puget Sound, Seattle district because of they want to have increased Arctic presence, especially during tensions with Russia. But I'm just wondering, I think this will be a great informer of, where these vessels could be located, and I guess looking at the infrastructure questions, whether or not it's in Roche Harbor or it's in Sydney, and who's going to be paying for it. So I don't know if, I mean, that's probably a discussion to be had at a higher level, but I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
That's exactly right, Werner. That's what we wanted to do is to conduct the study, address this data gap, and then provide this to others to inform further discussion about the benefits and potentially logistics and authorities, et cetera. So this information now is out there. Any other, intergovernmental or tribal discussions about it would be beyond the scope of our work. There are other technical aspects of the modeling that we could do, but we think we've hopefully addressed the main question, and we hope that it does spark now further discussion.
I saw Blair Boma's comment. Blair is one of our Puget Sound pilots and has been a tremendous involvement in the ecology study. Is Blair, are you still available to ask a question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So the county's, this is outside of the study, but the county's interpretation is, or the assumption is, that intervening efforts by the vessel's crew, the captain, pilot, will extend the time available. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, I just feel like it's important to understand that there could also be way shorter time.
Exactly.
Yeah, I just want to
Depending on
make sure
conditions.
Yeah, like
readiness.
Yep. Well, and the vessel, there's many bad things. Many things can happen, and hopefully the operators can turn the vessel away from the land or the grounding point. But there's times when something might happen that is like the worst thing that could happen. You might get turned towards turn point, and there just isn't time. So my only concern is that people maybe take the percentages, the saved percentages of this study literally. I think the percentages have a huge value in determining where to put a vessel, ERTV, but I would hate for people to think that percentage is an absolute number. I think it's a good comparative tool, but there's so many other variables, especially the worst case scenarios, that I just would caution, from my experience, whatever that value has. I think the percentages in this case are best case, which is fine, but I hope that that's understood.
That's an excellent point. Thank you.
So we spoke about the idea of trying to model a tug underway. And it seems to be an extraordinarily challenging thing to try to model, but so you have like that Monte Carlo situation where you have the vessel grounding at any number of points, but you have the tug at any number of points, rather than being either at, Sydney or Roche Harbor. Is that something that you looked at?
It is not something that we looked at. It is something that could be looked at, where you essentially do a Bayesian estimate of where the tug starts from, and then put that on top of the estimate of where it's going to. So it is a possibility to do something like that. But essentially, we had to do this in a short period of time with a limited amount of money, and we produced as much as we could in the analysis that we had the time and funding for.
But in fact, the Canadian tug scenario that exists right now is a vessel underway at the open ocean conditions for whatever Prince Rupert and Kitimat. But it just strikes me in a narrow waterway like this, that's probably, again, getting off the dock when you know of several vessels are going through. To Blair's point, it is optimistic if the vessel's at the dock, but it becomes far less optimistic if the vessel is underway.
Yeah. So if you remember, you go back to the curves that we had drawn for how many vessels are yet to be grounded. That curve, the shape of that curve doesn't change. So, you can look at how long it would take a vessel that's underway and closer than the closest tug that's not underway, how long it would take to get there. But it would have little value for a vessel that's underway and farther away, or would take longer than the tug that's at the dock. So you would be really looking at the upper end of that curve for those vessels that are underway, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but the tug would only be underway in the proximity of the pulse of vessels that are coming through. They wouldn't just be wandering around. They would be in that, like you said, like in the Alaska model, it would be a sentinel, quote unquote, escort.
Yeah. So it would have no mobilization time, and it would be stationed closer to the the potential disabled vessel, and so its time of arrival would be shorter. At least I would assume that it would be shorter, and therefore it would be to the left on that curve of the tugs that are starting from the dock. You get an idea of at least what space you're looking at, but in terms of coming up with the actual time or the percentage of disabled vessels that it gets to before they ground, we would have to run numbers to get that, Fred.
So anyway, it's just clear to me that it's the operational performance of the vessel, in addition to its home port, that has a lot to do with its efficacy.
Yeah.
Okay, we are at time. So one last call for any questions.
I'm interested in, where do you see you want to go next, Marta?
Well, like I said, we have concluded this project, and I want to acknowledge that it was funded through EPA, National Estuary Program funding, that on a proposal that San Juan County submitted as part of the Puget Sound Action Agenda. So we basically concluded this part of the study, and what we want to do is get the information out to others, interested parties, elected officials, and transboundary forums to keep the discussion going. So we just want this to inform those discussions about vessel traffic safety.
Can I just ask if Jim Hodgins, who I see is on the line, who's done so many good studies for Canada, might have some suggestions about a path forward just to continue the dialogue with clear seas?
Hey, Fred. That's a great question. I think I would need to think more directly about that. I know we've just concluded a whole suite of analyses of vessel traffic along Canada's Pacific coast, and we're planning on expanding that out to the Atlantic and the Arctic coasts as well. But more specifically about steps forward for response and risk analysis and building safety nets, I think I'd have to put more thought into.
We would love to hear what you would suggest would be a follow-up study or question to ask, because clearly the government of Canada very much relies on your insights. And I know that Tim has contributed to those insights as well. And just hope that this isn't just a study to sit on the shelf, but to continue the dialogue.
And this is Werner one last time. I was just going to say that I think there is some really good precedent about working together. Of course, we have the transboundary forums that we talk at. We have the upcoming Clean Pacific Conference. I don't know how we make that decision of, you know, where this vessel is placed. And I think, you know, having that dialogue with other NGOs and other stakeholders will be important to try to figure that out. But there is a lot of precedent on, you know, US and Canada working together on that transboundary stuff. And I'm excited to, you know, see that Fred and others who have been working on the Quiet Sound program, you know, that came into fruition after, you know, the Port of Vancouver took the lead on its ECHO program. And we're seeing, you know, efforts starting to emerge at the International Maritime Organization to increase cooperation and coordination between the US and Canada on that sound program. So there's precedence on, you know, working together at these international fora and trying to come up with, you know, a sensible plan to place certain infrastructure things around, you know, the Salish Sea. So this is another great study that will help inform that decision.
And this is Brian Kirk from Ecology. And I just wanted to thank Marta and Tim and Hig and Sierra and Tarang for, you know, for all the great work that you've done in this study. I always enjoy the chance to learn from the NUCA team and from Tarang's team with the Salish Sea model, and, you know, and how forward-leaning San Juan County always is in advancing the thinking around these topics. As Marta mentioned, Ecology has been tasked with the legislature with building a quantitative oil spill risk model, and then immediately using that model to conduct a couple of analysis efforts, one of which will look at the question of whether an ERTV could reduce oil spill risks for Haro Strait, Boundary Pass, and Rosario. And we're going to get going on that work in earnest. You'll start to hear more about that in the fall of this year. And we anticipate really kicking off those two analysis projects early in 2022. And there will be, of course, opportunities for public review and input into our scope of work and participation throughout that analysis. So I think the timing is fantastic as far as we're concerned, that this report is out there, that we've had the chance to participate in the effort and really understand how this analysis came together and how to think about the results. So that will absolutely inform our thinking and path forward. The only other thing I wanted to say, if I could take just a minute, is I'm coming to this discussion fresh from the International Oil Spill Conference, which I don't know if some others in this group are participating in this week. But I had a chance to give a presentation at one of the panels and was talking about some of the vessel traffic risk work that we've done in Ecology, specifically talking about the Grace Harbor risk analysis project that we did. It's been a few years now, but the conference was supposed to be last year and then got postponed, and they're just now having the conference. And the reason why I mention that is because it's an international audience at the Oil Spill Conference, as the name implies, and all of the questions that I got during that session were all coming from this well, I guess I can't say that word, this astonishment, that's a word I can say, and recognition of how unique this region of the world is. And, they were asking me, well, how can you even talk about oil spills in the Pacific Northwest when everyone there is so observant of what's going on the waterway, and everything is under a microscope, and you have this tremendous pressure from tribes and from stakeholders. And the point that I was trying to make is that this is such a fantastic environment to think about these topics and do this kind of work, and it's because of the participants on this call and every other time that the idea of maritime traffic and oil spill risk and prevention, all of those things, they really enjoy this very robust participation and thinking by really smart, informed people. And I tried to demonstrate to everybody what a strength that is. I'm not sure that they fully believe me, but it's just an interesting contrast coming, straight from that panel to this discussion. So that's more than you wanted to hear from me. But Marta and Tim and Tarang and teams, thanks again. I really enjoyed this process, and it's definitely given us a lot to think about.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for that addition and those thoughts. And I mean, the fact that we got such a really good group of project contributors, I want to acknowledge and thank them for their time and for their insights and assistance throughout this. And just a huge reach out of gratitude to Tim and Tarang and Sierra and Hig. This was really a Herculean effort. We fast tracked this, and they did all this work in just a matter of a few months. And we wanted to get it done. We had a limited budget, and they really came through. So as you said, Brian, people are engaged. They want to do it. They want to get involved. They want to help. This is not only our livelihoods, but vital to our economies, and we really need to protect this area and do everything that we can to protect these waters from the current threats and also into the future. Without that, we'll never be able to achieve our Puget Sound recovery either. So, and really hopeful that this helps with some more transboundary coordination and discussion. So I will wrap up with that. I really want to thank everybody that participated today and your helpful comments and questions. And this webinar will be published also on our local integrating organization webpage, the San Juan LIO webpage, next week, as well as the report and fact sheet are there. So just want to thank everybody. Great work, and we will be in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks.